Revelation 16 is one of the most remarkable chapters for this last generation of Christadelphians, because it leads us right up to where we are now. We're almost at the end of the sixth vial, and we are considering in our studies all 7 vials of the wrath of God. And when we get to the sixth vial and we follow its history from 1820 down to our day, we will see the pristine accuracy of Bible prophecy. It's a marvel that so much historical detail can be indicated by symbol. We're going to see quite a bit of that tonight. Symbols which provide detail concerning the history of the last couple of hundred years. So tonight we're going to have a look specifically at the second and third vials of the wrath of God. This is from verses 3 to 7 of Revelation chapter 16. In our first study, of course, we considered the background and the lead-in in chapter 15 to these pouring out of the vials of the wrath of God. Now, the word vial in the Greek actually means a bowl. That's why you've seen on the screen behind me a bowl being poured out. And of course these bowls represent the pouring out of divine judgment on the Catholic system since the French Revolution. French Revolution, of course, being the first vial of the wrath of God, occurring in 1789 and running through to 1819. The section, as I said, that we're going to have a look at is this section, verses 3 to 7. And when you read that passage from verses 3 to 7, the one thing that becomes obvious is that there's a seeming dichotomy. Why should there be an emphasis on the second vial and the pouring out upon the sea when the judgments are about the Catholic system that's on the earth, to use the apocalyptic term? What has the sea got to do with the work of judging the Catholic system? And that's a pretty obvious question. Now, we're going to see as we go forward that this second angel who pours out his vial upon the sea is actually referring to critical events that occurred between 1798 and 1805. So it's a period of 7 years or so of vital things that happened in relation to the divine judgments on the Catholic system. So the answer to that question, what has Britain's victories on the seas got to do with Yahweh's judgments on the Catholic system in Europe, is simply that God was marshalling and pushing Napoleon, who's going to affect the judgments in the next few vials, down to the fifth vial. He was pushing him to where he wanted him. Now, Napoleon, as you'll see later on this evening, believed that he was under the hand of divine providence, or at least he called it providence. And he actually said once that God leads my armies. So he had some inkling. In fact, he was very, very kind to the Jewish people. Now that must have come from the scripture, surely. So he had this inkling that God was behind what he was doing. However, of course, he didn't know what the plan or the purpose was, and he ended up foolishly marrying the daughter of the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire that he'd overthrown. And that became the downward hill for Napoleon. Everything went sour, basically, after that. And so what this second vial is about, and it's very important to understand this, is that because Napoleon chose to go to places where God did not want him, namely Egypt in 1798, and he amassed his forces at Calais on the European coast in order to do what Hitler wanted to do in 1940. He wanted to invade Britain. Well, God didn't want Napoleon in Britain. He wanted him in Europe. He wanted him to bring judgments upon the Catholic system of Europe. And so this is why the second vial is so important. It's actually about pushing Napoleon where God wants him. So God puts roadblocks in front of him. And he uses a man that has become famous in British history called Nelson, as we're going to see. That's why we have this curious placing of the second vial where it is here in Revelation chapter 16. So we're going to consider these two men of destiny. Here is Napoleon the general, and it is said that he was the most brilliant general and tactician, military tactician, since Alexander the Great. Now that's some commendation, because Alexander the Great has gone down in history as the greatest of all military tacticians. And we have a look at Admiral Nelson and his ship, the Victory. Now, God used the tactical genius of Admiral Horatio Nelson to defeat far numerically superior forces. When his career ended, when he died, of course, in the Battle of Trafalgar, as we shall see in 1805, Britain completely dominated the seas and did so for the next 100 years, which, of course, where that saying comes from, Britannia rules the waves. And that came from the victories of Nelson in 1798 through 1805. Now, don't give this man any more credit than he's due. He was brilliant as a tactician, but he was a man that was dissolute in his ways. He was unfaithful to his wife. His marriage fell apart. He was known to be a playboy. He was not popular with the upper class in Britain, but they needed him. They needed him because, of course, of his brilliance on the sea in charge of the British Navy. Let's just consider then this second vial. We read in verse 3, and it's just the one verse for the second vial. It said, "And the second angel poured out his vial upon the sea, and it became as the blood of a dead man." Now, this has, of course, implications for what was happening on the sea. And trade, for example, for both France and Spain, that was in league at the time with Napoleon, came to a halt because Britain controlled the sea. So that's one aspect of it, but there's another aspect which is far more dreadful. And that, of course, is that the sea literally became blood in the Battle of Trafalgar, as we shall see. It goes on to say there, that it became as the blood of a dead man, and every living soul died in the sea. Now, Nelson's victories began in August 1798 with what's commonly known as the Battle of the Nile. Now, what had happened in 1798 is that Napoleon had decided that he needed more victories. He'd won dozens of them in battle, but he needed more victories. And of course he wanted more territory. And he understood, he actually said that he who controls the Middle East, that is Egypt, he who controls Egypt rules the world, controls the world. Well, I think Vladimir Putin might have a similar policy to that, because the Bible tells us that Gog, initially when it comes down from the north, comes specifically to take Egypt. So that theory that he who controls Egypt, that is this land bridge between three major continents, controls the world. Well, that was his theory. And so he went there and he had a lot of success. He won victory after victory. There were a lot of problems, of course. Diseases and pestilences went through his army and all sorts of things happened. But he was very, very successful. But God didn't want him there. God wanted Napoleon in Europe. He wanted him to be bringing judgments upon the Catholic system, not on the Egyptians and the Middle East folk. He was in the wrong place. So what does God do? Well, he sends along this man, Admiral Nelson, at the head of a small, must be said, a small British fleet in the eastern Mediterranean at this time. Now, the French admiral who was here was defeated by this much smaller fleet commanded by Nelson at a place called Abu Qir in Egypt. It's near Alexandria, and you might be able to see on the map if you've got a pair of binoculars. Here's the Nile Delta down through here, and over here is Alexandria, and this is where the battle was fought. They call it the Battle of the Nile, Abu Qir, the Bay of Abu Qir. The defeat left Napoleon stranded in Egypt. He had no means of bringing in any supplies because his navy was now effectively destroyed. He had no means of escaping with his army. So guess what he does? Well, he actually escapes. He uses one of the ships, he gets through the British line, and he left behind 30,000 poor French soldiers in Egypt to die from all sorts of strange diseases that they were not used to. And so, that was just one of the things that he did to save his own skin. In fact, we're going to see that in the battles that Napoleon fought between 1896 and 1796 and 1815, when he was defeated at the Battle of Waterloo, more than 3 million Frenchmen lost their lives under his leadership. That's a pretty big number. And so this Battle of the Nile was won, and it led ultimately to a coalition of European states against France. So here's the details. Now, I like a little bit of historical detail. I hope you enjoy it as well. What we're going to see here is what actually happens in this battle, the Battle of the Nile. Now, here we've got the battle fought on the 1st and 2nd of August 1798. The French fleet had 17 ships. It was anchored close to the shore. This is the line of French ships. You see that green line here? That's the line of French ships. Nelson had 14 ships, and he came around this point, and what he did was fascinating. This was the brilliance of the man. He attacked from two sides, cutting off their escape. So he got his boats to go through the line, the French line, so they were actually attacking them from both sides. So they did a broadside. As they came down, they went through, and then they did a broadside from the other side of their ships, and of course they completely mangled the French navy that was anchored in that bay. All but 4 of the French ships were destroyed, or they surrendered, and some of them were run aground. So the whole navy basically was destroyed. This took away the power of Napoleon to do any more effective work in Egypt, and certainly took away his power to escape with his army. Now, let's move on to the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805, because this is the next major victory of the British Navy against the French and the Spanish. Here we've got the northern summer of 1805. Just like Hitler after him, Napoleon had his forces, his army, gathered on the shore near Calais to invade Britain, and they were building flat-bottomed boats, and of course what Napoleon needed was protection. And so he wanted his Admiral Villeneuve to bring the fleet up to protect the crossing. You know, history tends to repeat itself, doesn't it? Hitler couldn't invade Britain because he lost air supremacy. The Battle of Britain was won in September 1940, and that brought an end to his invasion plans. Same thing was going to happen to Napoleon here, because this is what happened. After a long chase of the French flagship from southern France to the West Indies, so they crossed the Atlantic, you had the French admiral with a few of his ships, and you had Nelson with a couple of his ships, and they were following all over the place, and they got back, of course, ultimately down here at the southern end of what we call Spain today, to the Cape Trafalgar, as it was known. And this battle at Cape Trafalgar has gone down in history as one of the most masterful exercises of naval military power of all time. And we want to show you a couple of the details of how this unfolded. Nelson was waiting 80 kilometres offshore from Cadiz. Cadiz was the port of the French and Spanish. And he was waiting out here. This is the main body of Nelson's fleet. And he had these smaller ships, frigates and others, that went right back that 80 kilometres, almost they were actually spying on Cadiz. Well, of course, the problem was no radios, no telephones, no satellites. So how do they communicate? So this is the reason why he had all these boats. They were in distance of each other, so they actually see each other right to the shore, 80 kilometres away. And what they did, of course, in those days is that they communicated by flags. And so the flags were put up. And here we've got a picture of Nelson signalling the fleet. You see this bunch of flags here? Each one of those had a special message. They had a manual that told you what the flag meant. And so they would hoist the flag, and then the next boat would hoist its flag, and the next one would, until they got 80 kilometres from Cadiz out to Nelson's main fleet. You know, we live in this technological age where everyone carries around a phone in their hand. You can be in contact with the rest of the world instantly, can't you? Well, it's not like that. It wasn't like that 200 years ago. So this is what happened. The intended route of Vice Admiral Pierre de Villeneuve was to come down through the Straits of Gibraltar, out of the port of Cadiz, with both the French and Spanish navies. And they had 33 ships. And they left Cadiz on the 19th of October 1805. They were intending to come down here and to bring much needed troops to Italy to break the British blockade. And they had to get through this very narrow Strait of Gibraltar. But what happened was that Nelson, with his fleet of 27 ships, engaged the French and the Spanish fleet on the 21st of October. And this is what happened. So out comes the French and Spanish fleet. And Nelson, of course, who had the advantage of the wind, actually cut them off. So they couldn't get through the Straits of Gibraltar. So they had to turn around to go back to Cadiz. And of course they tried to get back to Cadiz, but they had the problem that they're actually tacking into the wind. Nelson, meanwhile, he of course goes up alongside of the French and Spanish fleet, and he positioned himself to their west. And of course that was a brilliant idea. Reason being, of course, that when he turned on them, he had the wind behind him, and they were actually fighting their way into the wind. And when you've got sailing ships, you'll know that that's not an easy task. So he had a tactical advantage. It was a brilliant manoeuvre. So here's a picture. This is a depiction of what actually happened on that day, the 21st of October 1805. All of these red dots you can see here, that's the French and Spanish fleet. And you see that they're in a ragtag formation. And the reason for that, of course, is that they're all tacking. They're tacking into the wind. Whereas Nelson's got his fleet out here. So this is Nelson's line, and this is Admiral Collingwood's line to his south. This is the wind direction. It's coming from the northwest. And so it pushes Nelson's fleet into the very heart of the Spanish and French line. And of course, Collingwood does the same. He comes from what they call the leeward side, and he does this. And they actually punch through, and of course they almost completely destroyed the fleet. It was a disorderly line. It was easy to manoeuvre around them and to cut them down. So this is what happened. They go in there through the line of French and Spanish ships, and the rest, of course, as they say, is history. Now this is an artist's depiction at the height of the Battle of Trafalgar. And one of the most effective weapons that Nelson used was what they called the 68-pounder smasher. And they had this particular gun at the bow, near the bow of each of the ships, so that as they approached, they could actually fire to the front. Now, normally, of course, with those ancient ships, they would fire out of the side. So you'd have to get alongside and fire at each other. Of course, that's pretty dangerous stuff. So they had this 68-pounder, and they were able to dismast many of the enemy ships with a particular shot that they used. Now you can see, of course, if you've got good eyes, you can see down here they've got these two balls of cannon shot, and there's a chain that binds them together. So there's a 2-foot chain. And what they did is they would fire this out of their cannon, and of course these two balls are heading towards the enemy ship, and one ball goes one side of the mast, and the other ball goes the other side of the mast, and there's a chain. And of course the chain is like a chainsaw. It just cut the mast off. And when you cut a mast off, a fighting ship, then it's like cutting the arms off of a soldier. He's got no chance of dealing with you. And that's what happened to many of the ships in this Battle of Trafalgar. Those who were there recorded that the sea turned red. It turned red with the blood of the slain. Of the French and the Spanish, 4,408 were killed. 2,545 were wounded. A lot of blood flowed into the sea. And that's why, if you have a close look, you can probably see there's that little red tinge in that picture to indicate the spilling of that blood. I think, when you look at verse 3 of Revelation 16, the detail is awesome, isn't it? It says, "And it became as the blood of a dead man, So the sea became blood, literally. Now, of course, it has another meaning, as I said. The other meaning is that the sea being a representation of nations, and this affected the trade on the sea, and so the livelihood of France was damaged by Britain's control of the oceans. But I think that's an awesome detail in symbol of what actually happened on the 21st and 22nd of October 1805. Among the British, there were 449 dead, and one of those was Admiral Nelson himself, and 1,241 wounded. And of course, it's been well documented, the death of Nelson on that particular day. He, of course, was shot by a sniper on one of the French ships who was up at the top of a mast, and he could see Nelson. Nelson would never go down, and he would never escape from the most dangerous place. He was always there in the middle of the deck, commanding, and of course they put him in a position of jeopardy. And so the sniper shot down from a height, the bullet went through his shoulder and down and lodged in his spine. So he wasn't going to live, and of course he died that particular day. Before the battle, he had signalled the fleet with one of those flags with the message, "England expects that every man will do his duty." Now, not much has changed, has it? In the 20th century, that's exactly what Britain had to do in 2 world wars. Every man had to do his duty, and many millions of them died doing it. And so we've got this man who's gone down in history as famous, who was used by God until God did not need him anymore. And that's exactly what happened to Napoleon. God used him until he didn't need him anymore. Who knows what's going to happen to a man like Donald Trump, who got into power against all the odds. God will use him until he doesn't need him anymore. And if he disappears this year, it'll be because God doesn't need him anymore. So we'll have to wait and see. If God needs him, then miracles will happen and he'll be back in power again. That is the way that the angels work. The Most High does rule in the kingdom of men. Now, carried below the deck, Nelson covered his face. He didn't want to be seen by his men because he knew what they would do. And those who saw him coming down, being carried down to the lower deck, they said, "Look, no, treat him first." They wanted to save their admiral. They were prepared to die to save him. And he said, "No, look, let me die." His wound was fatal. He knew that. And this bullet that had lodged in his spine eventually killed him at 4:30 in the afternoon. And I've actually been on the Victory. It's there, as you'll see in a moment, at Portsmouth. And I've been to the very spot where Nelson died on the lower deck of HMS Victory. This is a photograph that I took in the summer, the northern summer of 2005. It was the 200th anniversary of the Battle of Trafalgar. And so I went aboard at Portsmouth. This Victory, it's actually sort of raised up out of the water so it doesn't degenerate. And it was completely restored when I was on it. You'll see the shiny new things that they've done on this ship. So we were there to relive some history. And here are some of the things that they had done. This was Nelson's room at the very back of the ship. This was the captain's, the admiral's quarters. And that, of course, was quite plush, as you could expect. And all over this ship there were indications. They had a spot. This plaque here actually marked the spot where he fell when the bullet went down through his shoulder. So, it's all there. Scripture screaming out at you in the things that have been preserved. Now let's turn to the other man of destiny, to Napoleon Bonaparte. He was born Napoleone Bonaparte in Corsica, which at the time was being ruled by France. He was born on the 15th of August 1769. Now, calculations. The French Revolution began in 1789. So how old was he? He was 20 years of age. And he was effectively Emperor of France by age 30. This is an incredible story. This man wasn't even French. He didn't even speak French very well. And by 30, he becomes the Emperor of France. You reckon God might be at work here? Well, I want to show you he was at work in this man. God knew the tactical genius of Napoleon. He knew what could happen, and he made sure it did happen. This is what I love, brothers and sisters and young people, about Bible prophecy. If God wants something to happen, it doesn't matter what men do. It happens. And we have to have faith and conviction in that, and never abandon what we know to be true from the Word of God. It will happen, regardless of what the world looks like at the time, regardless of what people say. Even in our own community, it will happen. And it happened here in history. We have to have that kind of confidence. Napoleon was the second of 8 children. And he was in Corsica when the French Revolution began. He wasn't even supportive of the French. He was actually anti-French. Now, he'd spent some time as a young man, as a teenager, in a school, in a college in Paris, in France. He'd learned a lot of things. He learned, of course, he was a terrific artillery officer. But he didn't like the French very much. Isn't it amazing that he becomes the leader of France? Why? Because God wanted a man who would bring judgments upon the Catholic system in vengeance for what they had done to his people in the past. So he was here in France. He was back in Corsica when the French Revolution broke out, and at the end of the Reign of Terror in 1794, which we considered in our last class, he was there to be used by the revolutionaries. He began his career as an artillery officer fighting the British in Italy. In fact, he should have been dead. I mean, the British had superior artillery. They had ships in the bay firing onto the land. And he was put in charge of an artillery site where he could fire over into the bay. And most of the men that were in that particular artillery site were killed, not Napoleon. And in fact, a lot of the battles he fought, and he fought many, many battles, he used to be in the front line at times. He would actually lead the troops. And yet while men were falling around him, full of holes, he survived. How come? Well, because you see, those bullets were directed away from him. I don't think there's any doubt that the angels were there, because God wanted this man for his purpose. And while he was there fulfilling God's purpose, he was successful. When he turned away from God's purpose, the wheels fell off. And there's a lesson to be learned in that, isn't there? While we are doing God's will, brothers and sisters, things will go okay. They won't be perfect. This life's not perfect. They'll go okay, and we'll come through. When you turn, that's when the wheels fall. So we need to learn that lesson. So let's just review his rise to power. After the Reign of Terror ended in 1794, Napoleon tried to stay above the turmoil of French politics. In 1795, he was invited by the Directory, which was the leadership at the time in France, to suppress a number of internal revolts. There were monarchists in France. They wanted to return the monarchy to power. And so there were all sorts of internal revolts going on in France. So the Directory said, well, we need your help. We know how good you are with artillery and leading troops. Can you help us? He said, yeah, sure. So his success led to his appointment of France's army in Italy. And so in 1796 through 97, he spent a couple of years in Italy winning 27 battles in a row. It was just unbelievable. He was fighting the strongest army in the world. It was the army of the Austrians, which of course was the centre of the Holy Roman Empire. And so his victories were just an incredible achievement. And of course, he didn't just stop with winning battles. He created the Cispadine Republic in Italy and declared himself as its president in October 1797. He's 26 years of age, and he's ruling Italy. This is this man that God is going to use. In 1799, Napoleon formed an alliance with some of the leading politicians, and he overthrew the Directory, which was ineffective at the time. And he became the first consul of 3. There were 3 of them appointed. And of course, being the first consul meant he was the only consul, effectively, because he got rid of the other 2 old chaps in time. And he became, effectively, the dictator of France. He was 30 years of age. It's an incredible rise to power. But what God wanted him for was not just his tactician skills as a politician, but as a military commander. And his wars were to be the means of divine judgment upon the Catholic system. This is what is meant in verse 4 of Revelation 16. And the third angel poured out his vial upon the rivers and fountains of waters, and they became blood. And I heard the angel of the waters say, Thou art righteous, O Lord, which art and wast and shall be, because thou hast judged thus. For they have shed the blood of saints and prophets. Now when you read the word saints, it doesn't mean, of course, what you and I are today and what we hope to be in the kingdom age. It's a much wider group than that. It's any opposition to the Catholic system that God used. Some of them, of course, didn't have the truth. Many of them didn't have the truth, but they were against the Catholic system. So they're called saints or sanctified ones for that reason. But amongst that wider group of saints is a special class. The representatives of the day of you and me. The ones who understood the truth and who were endeavouring to follow it and live it. That was a special class. So God was bringing judgment, not just because his own peculiar people were being brutalised by the Catholic system, but because those who opposed the Catholic system on a much wider scale were also brutalised by it. So we read here, For they have shed the blood of saints and prophets, and thou hast given them blood to drink, for they are worthy. And I heard another out of the altar. Now this is interesting, because we're going to see, of course, that the altar, which is referred to back in chapter 6 of Revelation, where there were souls under the altar, these were people who had been slain by this system down through the centuries. And so the voices, as it were, not that they were alive, of course they weren't, they were sleeping, but it is as though they were speaking, though they were crying out for vengeance. And that's why verse 7 is so important to you and me. These are the voices of the past. This is the voices of our brothers and sisters of old, crying out. And you and I are shortly going to be involved in their work to bring the judgments to their conclusion in the 7th vial of the wrath of God. I heard another out of the altar say, Even so, Lord God Almighty, true and righteous are thy judgments. So here's the man. Here's the man that God appoints to bring those judgments, or at least to begin the process of those judgments way back in the late 1700s. As I said, in March 1796, Napoleon at the age of 26 became general of the army of Italy, the French army in Italy. He fought 7 campaigns against the Austrian power in Italy between 1796 and 1800. He won 26 battles in 1796 and 1797 alone. But it wasn't an easy beginning. And the reason why he was successful is what we've just read in verse 6. They have shed the blood of saints and prophets, and thou hast given them blood to drink. And you just saw some images behind me of the slaughter of those who witnessed against the Catholic system. Like this one here, the slaughter of the Waldenses in Piedmont. Now this is very important because of what we read here about where the judgments were to be poured out. Because it was in this area of northern Italy where the Waldenses in particular suffered at the hands of the Catholic system. And what they're doing here is they've come along to a town and they've got the Waldenses, men, women and children, and they're doing a Nebuchadnezzar. They are throwing these people into a fiery furnace, and the screams of men, women and children perishing in those flames can still be heard, so to speak. That's why these judgments came upon that system, for they are worthy, we read. So where is this rivers and fountains of waters that we read of here in verse 4? Well, it's this region. You've got Italy here, you've got, of course, this is the Piedmont, this area here, you've got this area here, which of course is the Alpine region of Italy, and it's full of rivers and streams and lakes. The great rivers of Europe, the Rhone, the Rhine, the Danube, and the Po all rise in this region, and are fed by the melting snows, of course, of the Alps, as are hundreds of lakes. It's like a lake district. So it's the place of the rivers and fountains of waters where much of the terrible persecution of the saints occurred. So this is where, of course, blood was going to be poured out in vengeance. And this is where Napoleon spent a couple of years winning 26 battles. And a lot of people died in this region. Now, it wasn't an easy beginning, as I said, because when he arrived at Toulon, right on the eastern southern tip of France, when he arrived there, the French army was in tatters. They were not provisioned, so they were actually killing and eating their emaciated horses. They had very poor equipment. They had very poor clothing. So Napoleon demanded from the authorities in Paris that they do something about this, and he got enough supplies to actually put together an effective army. And so he began his campaigns, and he defeated the Austrian army here in northern Italy, in the Piedmont, and then he chased the Austrian army right across to the border of Austria, and he pushed them into Austria, winning battle after battle with tactical genius against a far superior army in terms of equipment and numbers. And so his victories were just incredible. And you see this man, as to why he's gone down in history, winning so many battles in just a couple of short years. So this is where the judgments were poured out upon the Holy Roman Empire and its forces in this place, and upon the Catholics of that region. Well, the Pope didn't respond very kindly to this, so he decided he was going to deal with Napoleon. So, after defeating the Austrians in Lombardy, Napoleon turned on the papacy. The Pope gathered an army of fanatical peasants, or Catholics of course, and attacked the French. He was defeated, his forces were defeated at a place called Faenza, and another defeat at Ancona. And with Napoleon advancing on Rome, the Pope sued for peace. He thought it was a better deal. At enormous cost and under utterly humiliating terms, a treaty was granted to the Pope. The papacy and its adherents drank blood, but worse was to come for them in the fifth vial of judgments, which we'll consider in subsequent studies, God willing. So let's have a look at the final phase of the third vial. After his triumph in Italy, Napoleon looked for new conquests and decided on Egypt. So let's just step back to what we were talking about a little while ago. When he decided that he'd won enough battles in Italy, he'd created the Cispadane Republic, he'd made himself the president, he wanted some more tassels on his military coat, and so he decided he would go to Egypt. Well, God didn't want him in Egypt. He was doing a great job in Italy, the homeland of the Catholic system. Well, God didn't want him to go to Egypt, so he went, and he went right up to a place called Acca in Israel today, he had all these victories, but it was all of no point. And so once his navy was destroyed by Nelson in 1798, the wheels fell off. So though military successful, the campaign was a disaster in the end due to Britain's supremacy on the sea. In Napoleon's absence, the Austrians, with help from Russia, meanwhile, because he'd vacated Italy, the Austrians and the Russians came back and they retook Italy. So all of that effort that he expended was wasted. Well, it wasn't wasted because you see he had to go back again, and he was going to bring more blood to soak the earth in Italy. There was huge slaughter and suffering on both sides in those conflicts in 1798. He forsook his army in Egypt, leaving behind 30,000 men. He returned to Paris, where by turn of events he became the first consul after the coup of 1799. Now that too was a close run thing. He, of course, had ambitions. He was going to become the leader of France at the time when the revolution was sort of beginning to peter out. There was a lot of confusion in France. The leadership was poor. A lot of suffering going on. So this was an ideal opportunity to step in and rule this country. So on November the 9th and 10th in 1799, he overthrew the Directory. But it was only through the intervention of his brother, actually, that came to pass, because they were going to kill him on the spot, these people. But his brother stepped in and convinced them that this was the best way to go. And it led, of course, to more blood to be drunk by the adherents to the Roman Catholic Church. Napoleon gathered an army. He crossed the Alps and retook Italy in the campaign of 1800, which again has gone down in history as one of the most remarkable military feats. And the reason for that you'll see in a minute. The passage of the Alps in winter, not summer, in winter, via the St Bernard Pass, which wasn't like it is today, by a fully equipped army of 60,000 men, was said to be absolutely impossible. It could not be done. Well, it was done. Napoleon left Geneva on the 8th of May and he arrived unopposed at Milan on the 2nd of June 1800. The Austrians were defeated at the Battle of Montebello, and then in the next battle they were again decisively defeated at Marengo on the 14th of June 1800. The Austrians suffered immense losses in those battles and they withdrew, leaving Italy to Napoleon again. So this is the second time he's conquered Italy, and more blood has been poured out, especially in those regions of the rivers and fountains of waters in northern Italy. And finally, on the 8th of January 1801, France and Austria signed the Treaty of Luneville. Now, Luneville's a little town in France. I've actually been there, sitting in a train, and it stopped at a station. I looked out, Luneville. So this was the place where that treaty was signed in 1801. Well, it wasn't very long before Napoleon's ambitions led to him crowning himself as Emperor of France on the 2nd of December 1804. Now, he was a forerunner to Vladimir Putin. You know, recently on July the 1st, Vladimir Putin, they held a plebiscite in Russia, and he got his changes to the constitution approved by the public. Of course, it was a foregone conclusion that it would get up, and it got up, and of course it allows him to be president of Russia until 2036. It was all done through seemingly democratic processes. Well, Napoleon was the first to exercise that kind of political clout, because you see, he held several plebiscites, couching the vote, the referendum in certain terminology that people said, "Oh, well, that'll be a good thing." See, and eventually he got them to agree that he should be president of France. But he wasn't happy. He wasn't going to have the Pope to put the crown on his head. You see the Pope behind here in this picture? See this Philistine Dagon fish hat, which is the papal hat? Well, the Pope's sitting there. He come all the way from Rome. He was thinking that he would be the one to put the crown on Napoleon's head, and Napoleon lifted the crown and put it on his own head. He crowned himself as Emperor of France. This is what he said on the 2nd of December 1804. "I am the instrument of Providence. She will use me as long as I accomplish her designs. Then she will break me as a glass." He could not have been more accurate, because God did use this man to bring to pass his judgments upon that system. And of course, the time came when Napoleon ended up marrying the daughter of the emperor he had overthrown, corrupting God's purpose, and he had a little bit more success, but not a great deal more success in the disastrous campaign of 1812, where 500,000 men of the 600,000 he took with him perished in the winter the Russian winter, just like Hitler's army was to do in 1942-43. Okay? History repeats itself over and over again. So she was to break him as a glass. And this man who became Emperor of France at age 30, basically, died in 1821. Where's the mathematicians in the room? He was born in 1769. He dies in 1821. 52 years of age. Nelson died at 47. Napoleon dies at 52. Isn't it incredible how God uses men like that and then takes them out of the way when he no longer needs them? So true and righteous were the judgments that God brought upon that system through Napoleon. He was an unwitting instrument of judgment on the Holy Roman Empire and the Catholic Church. While he fought against them, he enjoyed great success. When he turned to fight Britain, Egypt and Russia, he suffered defeat. His campaigns brought untold suffering to Italy, Austria and Prussia. Fitting vengeance for the blood of God's servants and anti-papal witnesses who had been persecuted mercilessly in previous centuries. You know, I want to conclude tonight by looking at verse 7 again. And I heard another voice, that is, out of the altar, say, "Even so, Lord God Almighty, true and righteous are thy judgments." Now just slip back with me to chapter 6 of Revelation. In chapter 6 of Revelation, we have, of course, the record here of the opening of the seals. And the fifth seal is recorded in verse 9. "And when he had opened the fifth seal, I saw under the altar the souls of them that were slain for the word of God and for the testimony which they held." Now, of course, the church would say, well, there you are, there's an immortal soul, you know, and he saw immortal souls. Well, we know that's not what it means. So here are people who had died under persecution because they believed the truth. And that system, of course, hated them in its pagan form and then later in its pagan Christian form. It hated God's people. And they cried, it says in verse 10, with a loud voice, saying, "How long, O Lord, holy and true, dost thou not judge and avenge our blood on them that dwell on the earth?" And the earth there means the Roman earth. Okay, so here's the cry. Well, God answers that plea, as we know. Because when you move on, you find, for example, in chapter 8, we come to chapter 8, we have a look at verse 3. This is the opening of the seventh seal. In verse 3 of chapter 8 we read, "And another angel came and stood at the altar." Remember, we read about the altar in chapter 16. "He came and stood at the altar, having a golden censer, and there was given unto him much incense," and we know that incense represents prayer, "that he should offer it with the prayers of all saints upon the golden altar which was before the throne." Now, do you reckon God might have responded to these appeals? You know, as people were perishing in the fires, having their heads chopped off, what would they do for their last moments, do you think? They would be appealing to their God, to remember them, and to remember those who had committed such horrible things against them because of religion. Yeah, and he did. And he began it. He began that work through the Vials in 1789. And that work rolled on through the mission of Napoleon in the second through the fifth vials of the wrath of God. That's his response. That's why verse 7 of chapter 16 is so important. The desperate prayers of our persecuted brethren between AD 303 and 311 and those dreadful persecutions that preceded the overthrow of the pagan empire by Constantine. It didn't rescue many of them from the dreadful depredations of the time of Diocletian and his three other thugs that ruled with him. Didn't rescue them from violent deaths, but it guaranteed divine intervention for vengeance. And we are looking at that as we look at the vials of the wrath of God. So what are the principles that we learn from that, brothers and sisters and young people? Our prayers may not resolve our immediate problems, but may have impacts on others that we know nothing about. That's why it is so important to be loyal through trial. It's why it's so important not to forsake the things that we know are right. We don't know how God's going to work, but what we know is He will. He will work, and He's working here in Revelation chapter 16. Never forget, today we worship in freedom because God answered the prayers from under the altar. It was the French Revolution that brought about the times in which we live, when liberty, equality and fraternity are the order of the day. They have one good aspect, don't they? We can gather like we do tonight. Anybody throwing rocks through the window? Are you fearful when you walk out the door of being thrown into a fiery furnace? No, our brethren were. We don't have that fear. Why? Well, because the judgments that God brought upon that system beginning in 1789. That we should remember. In our next study, God willing, we're going to have a look at the fourth and fifth vials of the wrath of God under the title, They Gnawed Their Tongues for Pain. So come prepared. There'll be a lot of pain to be talked about in the fourth and fifth vials of the wrath of God.